the brother covered so much in his presentation. Some of that I'll probably go over, but just trying to be strategic. We know that we've been in this land for more now than 400 years. And we know coming out of 1865, I think we founded more than 1,200 Black communities. The necessity of that day forced us into that. But we also know that in that period of time between 1865 and 1960, most of those communities were destroyed, or we were driven out by Jim Crow laws and by really terrorist sheriff and police departments. But many of our communities were burned to the ground and our people displaced right here in good old the United States of America. So much of what the minister was saying in terms of their blueprint and their plan, they've carried a lot of that out. But our resilience have been a little bit more than I think they expected. They've never really truly understood how we've been able to stand. And so one of the things that the message had brought, though there was other teachers before, there was no teachers that had the effect the messenger had and the wide range program in terms of solution for African people. And when you talk about the great separation, there's still those who think there's some way we can merge and unite with the European American or with the European worldwide. There's nothing in our history, nothing in his history that showed a possibility of that, neither on the continent of Africa, in the Caribbean, Central South America, Australia, Southeast Asia, where he genocided millions of our people over these last few centuries. And so when the messenger talked about the great separation as being a necessity, he was talking about our ability to get to know ourselves. He said that was essential. We must know ourselves. Our children and our people must learn about the Harriet Tubman, the Frederick Douglass, the Toussaint Louverture, the Nat Turner, the Marcus Garvey, the Drew Ali, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who's one of our great lights, because most of the people that would follow him, that many of us follow their teachings but don't come back to the messenger, got it from the messenger. You know, I was an imam of the Muslim Mosque, Inc., founded by Malcolm X. I went to Mecca decades ago as El-Hajj Amin Shaheed, but Malcolm was a student of the messenger. Most of the brothers that made up the Black Panther Party, at least in New York City, and the Black Liberation Army, they came out of the Muslim Mosque, Inc. Some came from the Nation as Children, and they came out into building the Black Panther Party. Those were the cause of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. A lot of people don't know the history, so they don't understand the connections. But one of the things that I think history has made clear is that we cannot build a nation together in another man's nation. And we see the Chinese are in America, but wherever the Chinese are, they're under their sovereign jurisdiction. They have Chinatowns as the headquarters of that sovereignty. Even when they don't live in Chinatown, their allegiance is to that sovereign community that is economically, politically, and solvently theirs. And then that is connected to their fatherland or motherland. And we find that with all other non-European groups in America. The East Indian community had sovereign Indian communities that is connected back to India, though they're right here in the United States of America. So the messenger made it plain to us that we have to get control of the economics, of the politics, and of the culture where we live. And Malcolm added a term to that, by any means necessary, which he learned in his teaching from the messenger. We have to learn to control, again, land, labor, and resources wherever we find ourselves. And I know Sister laid out the 4 points, but Sister, I tried to lay out 10 points on sovereignty, and I'm going to raise those 10. And if we are talking about sovereignty, we need to really understand, as we study history and we study culture, we study the history of both our enemies and our ancestors. You must know both. You must master both. So that we can understand, to be sovereign, we must have a self-governing state. To be sovereign, We need to have a permanent population. We must know our people and their number, and we must bring that population together on a defined piece of land, a defined territory. I mean, one of the books that everybody should still read today is Message to the Black Man. This is really the blueprint. And if you go to page 222 and to 224, the messenger speaks very clearly on this separation and the many multiple steps we must go through to qualify. The minister laid out a good bit of that training that's necessary to raise consciousness. But once we realize we have to have this permanent population, and we know we have them, we're nearly 60 million in the United States now. And when we talk about the Afrodescendant nation, we're talking about close to 100 million plus in the Western Hemisphere, not even counting the billions on the continent of Africa. And so we're talking about having a defined territory, even if that defined territory is not contiguous in the beginning, meaning we may be in South Carolina, we may be in Mississippi, we may be in Arkansas, but our numbers are such that we can control the economic, politics, and culture where we live and have a relationship to the other territories where we were doing the same thing, operating under the concept of the independence that one must have. You must be independent of any other foreign body determining how you're determining or self-determining. So the number 5 would be we must have internal authority. And then 6, we must have external capacity to engage with other nations in treaties and trade. And number 7, we want to make our own laws that govern our people. Number 8, we must be able to protect our people from aggression from others. And we're seeing that all over the country, the aggression of murdering us and hanging us and using the police department as death squad against us have never stopped since the Civil War. And it goes on every day in our communities across the country, except now they call it law and order. And so number 9, we want to protect the human rights of our people when we become the governing instrument for our people. And we want to be bound by international law and international obligations. And then we come back to what the messenger was trying to make clear to us, that you must know yourself, know thyself. And he speaks of this heavily in Message to the Black Man. Not only know thyself, you must love thyself. And you can only begin to love thyself if you know thyself. Because you can't build a nation with backwards, ignorant people who are self-destructive. You cannot build a nation with people who have a greater love for the enemy than they have for their ancestry. And that's why history becomes so important and so essential. And I think the messenger, thank God for him, have laid this thing out in the literature that he's left us. Even when we understand that when we talk about economic politics and culture, we must talk about sacred science. In this instance, the sacred science institution, we refer to it as Islam. We know that about 40% of us came to this country during that enslavement process were already Muslims before we left Africa. The Songhai Empire, the Mali Empire, those great empires were conquered. The Moorish Empire that was conquered in Spain, and those people were brought and sold into the Americas. Now, there's been this myth that, we forgot everything, we lost it. No, we didn't. We had to get clandestine. We had to go underground. We had to teach in all kinds of other secret ways, but we kept much of our system in fragments and pieces in our lives. That's why when we went through that Civil War, at least they'll admit to something like about 4,000 to 5,000 of us fought in the blue uniform, but we had more than that fighting behind the lines, sabotaging the Confederacy. If it wasn't for our involvement in their Civil War, the North would have never won it. We could really look at that as one of the wars of liberation process that we went through because of our contribution in the victory that was handed to the North. But that's not enough. If we don't establish a homeland for ourselves, then we will forever be slaves in someone else's homeland And they're not going to allow us to run their homeland. We've been trying that for decades. It hasn't worked. We've been governors, we've been mayors, we've been city council persons, we've even been the presidents of the United States of America. But one thing that has been made very clear, this is a nation that the Europeans came over deliberately to build for Europeans. And as the brother minister was laying out, as long as we are an asset, a labor asset to them, we're safe. But this thing we see around immigration, they long since replaced us as a large segment of the labor force. We've been replaced as the primary working class labor force in this country for more than 30 years now. And our male population have been tracked off to prison intergenerationally. And so someone whose father and grandfather was in prison is in that track from classroom to the prison that they've set up using drugs and law enforcement to manage the drugs that come into our community so they can monitor us breaking their civil laws so that they can incarcerate us and be covered by the 13th Amendment that we're not really free. They have the right by their law to put us back into slavery. And so the only way, and I've been all over this world, I've been all over the continent, the Caribbean, all through the United States in these 80 years that I've been on the planet. And the one thing that has been very clear, we must build a place for ourselves, a sovereign piece of territory that we govern by the principle, laws, concepts, and ideas that is humane for us. And we must be able to protect the integrity of those institutions that we establish. And so the great separation may sound to some like, oh, that don't sound and make sense. Study history. I say all the time, history will erase the mystery. If you study the historical relationship between us and the European community, both here and abroad, the story is the same, that they will not allow us to live as sovereign citizens in any state that they've established in Europe or the Americas. And so we have one choice if we want to truly be free, and that is to come together as a people, establish territory for ourselves, establish all of the pieces of a sovereign state that's necessary for people to govern and protect themselves. And we can start where we are by taking over the land and the labor and the resource in these communities we live in East St. Louis, where we're 90-something% of the population, and we have somebody 10% running the economy. When we go down to Maryland, where we have communities, cities that's 90-something% Black people, but they have no sovereignty, and they're some of the wealthiest in the country. Or we come to New York, where we have millions and millions of Black people, and we still operate like that plantation I grew up on in South Carolina. But if we're going to have freedom and be in charge of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for our people, we must look in terms of sovereignty. We must be in terms of understanding that separation may have many kinds of technical construct as we move towards the greater sovereignty and a greater contiguous land for ourselves, probably not in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of my children and grandchildren. So our great again, happy birthday. Thank you for the opportunity for me to even speak on your behalf and let you speak through me as you will speak through others. Salam alaikum. Assalam.